mention Dr. Nakiza and Dr. Umbello. Barry Nakiza is at Deakin University, and Steven, I don't really know, he has multiple affiliation. He's in the Netherlands now, he's an ethicist, and they helped me a little bit with the content of the slides. So my background, I haven't done any research for a very long time, 17 years, but I, at the beginning of an academic career in industrial engineering and design research, really looking at the process of design, including the cognition of design, which is my only professional link with mental health. And since then, I've been working in engineering management in the field of medical devices. For the last 2 years, I've been also an independent consultant in that field. So if you know any entrepreneur, Diapason Consulting, please send them my way. Even though I'm an engineer by training, working in regulated industry like the medical devices, I've been doing a lot of regulatory affairs. You know, you can't really release anything without the regulators having to rubber stamp whatever you're producing. Also a large part of quality assurance, which is a requirement from the regulation, and also something that I'm good at, having gone through modeling the design process. You know, describing processes is something I do pretty well. So I've interfaced with the FDA, the TGA, with many bodies taking care of the European regulation. By training, I was a hardware engineer, but I've been doing systems and more software. And for the last few years, working a little bit in AI. So that's for my professional background. Then AI is also something I'm really fascinated about. I've been reading quite a few books and sci-fi movies. And the concept of the singularity is really something that pretty much it's keeping me awake these days. The concept of technological, the ethics of technology as well. We started talking about consciousness a bit earlier. That's something that I find really interesting as well. I mentioned yesterday my passion for music and audiology, and how I think all this is sort of interrelated through the concept of mental health, which is my motivation for doing this talk. So I'm self-funded. I'm not affiliated to any institute or university or anything. So I created my own non-profit called AIMH2021, that's the Alliance for Transparency in Health Tech, to sort of give myself the support to do this sort of thing. And I also do some impact with this non-profit to help humanitarian engineers and humanitarian actors in general to navigate regulation. Because even if we want to send medical technology to developing countries, you still need to deal with the regulators. So I'm helping have sort of immediate impact with this side of things, and long-term impact. I'm trying to think about all these ethics of technology. And it's sort for me of a midlife crisis to reconciliate myself with my younger self when I was an academic, and I liked it really much. And this opportunity for silo breaking, really, I've talked today with a lot of people that I would have never talked with without doing that. So I'm very happy of my day and a half so far. And yeah, it's a form of self-treatment for me to resolve a form of cognitive dissonance. All those ideas that I can't use into my professional practice, it's giving me an opportunity to share them, hoping to find people to find them interesting, to contribute back to the open source community. I'm a big fan of Linux and open source technology altogether, but I'm not a real programmer, so I can't really contribute to the Linux kernel or this sort of thing. So helping the open source communities with medical technology is something I feel good doing. And part of my motivation is really to understand who are the regulator, what they do. I don't know if you have played the game of Pandemic. You have player cards, you can be a researcher, you can be a humanitarian engineer, you can be a logistics specialist. You have all sorts of roles that are very useful. You have clear rules of what you're supposed to do. And those rules, when you play the game, they make sense. How to solve the problem, how to fix the pandemic. But there's no regulator card. I did this one in Photoshop, or GIMP, the open source version of Photoshop, because there's no regulator in the game of pandemic. And a lot of people don't know what the regulators are doing. So that's part of my motivation also to explain to myself what are the regulators, because even though I work in medical devices, it's quite easy to just follow the rule, tick the boxes, but not really thinking about it. So I've been doing a lot of time thinking about it and trying to educate people about it as well. which I do also as part of my consultancy. But having this non-profit / research side gave me an opportunity to clarify my consulting message as well. I'm able now to tell to my clients, okay, I know the regulation, I can help you with them. And on the weekend, I can spend time thinking about them and asking questions without polluting my consulting message. So today I'm gonna talk of the regulation of technology in mental health, not only AI, technology in general. So looking at who and what, who are the regulators and what do they regulate, the link with ethics. And then I'm gonna do a SWOT. So what? I'm gonna do a sort of using SWOT as a tool to analyze this state of facts. And all that in the scope of transparency, which is my motivation again, and raising questions for future research. So the regulation, so what are the things that are regulated or not, and by whom? So in this space of mental health and technology, the first thing that is regulated is the act, the clinical intervention. And it has been discussed a little bit already today, like this afternoon, with this fascinating talk from Hamilton. It was great. I just want to put again my sci-fi kind of patient in the equation to say that there's a lot of things that are also not regulated, enhancement and modification. When you are not treating a disease, but if you just want to enhance yourself, you're outside of the regulation. The whole wellness space of just staying well is not generally regulated or not the same way. There's a concept of self-practice again, which may seem obvious that no, the regulators have nothing to do to whatever you want to do to yourself. But I was made aware relatively recently, for instance, of diabetes. There's a lot of technology in diabetes that is open source because it's, I wouldn't say better because I don't have enough evidence to say that, but that's providing maybe better value to the patient of using non-regulated do-it-yourself technology for closed-loop insulin dosing management. And the question arises, for instance, of parents who do that with their children. If they do that to themselves, of course, the regulators have nothing to do. But when you start doing that to your children, from a legal standpoint, that's really putting you in a weird area of using unregulated technology to touch a body that's not yours. You could potentially end up in jail or in a very bad position for child abuse. So I think that's a question that cannot be ignored. Even if I don't have a specific example of mental health in that case, I think the question needs to be raised anyway for mental health technology. And of course, clinical practice versus research, is it a continuum? Is it two different activities, etc.? So after the act, you have the technology itself that's regulated. When you purchase a computer, you have a lot of information written on the black box that provides the power. That's all things that describe all the regulatory testing that this thing has been through. That's true for hardware. That's also true for software. And there's a lot of regulation that's related now to data as well. And we have discussed that a lot already today. Talking about AI, you have the question of the software can be the actual code, can be the models that you code as produced after training. And you have, of course, a data set that has been used for this training. Recently, Facebook said, okay, we have deleted all our data sets of face recognition thing, but they didn't say anything about their models. So it's not necessarily obvious for people who don't know anything about AI, but these three elements are different, and it's important to know the difference. There's a case of the instruction for building the technology. Again, diabetes, help yourself kind of technology. What are the legal liability of people putting instructions online for building your own sensor or building your own insulin pump? There's a lot of legal questions there. And for apps, which we have discussed a lot already today, there's the question of the apps, the hardware on which the apps run. Does the TGA or the FDA have something to do with the phones you're buying? And the distribution channel, who's in charge of providing the app to the patient? And of course, the question of combining the two, because technology is one thing, what the clinicians are doing with the patients are another thing, but when you put technology in the middle, there's two different sides. And the manufacturers of technology have an intended use in their technology, but how this technology is used at the end of the day can be very different. And this example has not much to do with mental health, but if you look at a box of cotton buds for cleaning your ears, in the box it's written that you're not supposed to use it in your ear. But research shows that 60 or 70% of people use it in their ear. And again, there's this concept of the hypocrisy sometimes of the regulation of, oh, you just put something on a label and you don't have to deal with it anymore. I think it's a bit immature as an attitude to think that, okay, we say it on label not to burn yourself, so that's not our fault if people are burning yourself. I think there's an ethical responsibility for manufacturers of technology to go a bit beyond that and still to take ownership for whatever they put on the market. So the act, I'll just do 10 seconds on this slide. I know nothing about it. I did 3 screenshots to say, okay, I've done a little bit of homework. I don't know anything. There's people in this room that will know way more than that on that. Those professional bodies are in charge of regulating the professional practice. That's all what I'll say. I'll mention it a little bit in a conclusion slide. Regulating research. So, was mentioned the concept of bioethics earlier. I think that this whole context of regulating research, that the modern framework for that came out after World War II, when all the horror of that happened during World War II were discovered. A lot of doctors were part of that and doing very nasty things under the cover of research. And first the Nuremberg Convention and then the Helsinki Convention that has been updated quite a few times since have been put together to implement ethics protection into the act of research. From my limited background, so again, I come from a medical device standpoint. I don't come from research, I don't come from clinics, etc. What I've been facing with my experience with the regulators is that to them, when you do research as an investigator, something that happens academically or with clinicians, is different from the type of research that as a manufacturer, we need to put together to produce the objective evidence that they want to see. With, of course, the academic side of research, publication and spreading of the data is, or at least spreading of the knowledge is the main outcome of this. In the case of manufacturer-initiated research, that's the other way around. Quite often, they try to hide the most of it. They don't want their competitors to know about it. And sadly, they don't want the patients either to know about it. They just want to do the minimum that the regulator is asking them. And of course, more and more in research, there's this whole concept of data regulation coming from HIPAA, GDPR in Europe, etc., that is constraining research a lot. And the technology, so really my bread and butter, the regulation of medical technology. So there's a very complex list of regulatory bodies. The FDA in the US, the TGA here, the concept of notified bodies, the concept of certification lab, all those things are many different things. They all rely on the concept of intended use. So what is the purpose of the technology and the indication for use, which is what are the limits of it. So the intended use of a vaccine is to increase the body immune system to infection by the virus. Indication for use would be from 16 years old up to 80 years old, or this sort of limitation. If you are talking about a device, the indication for use may say you can use the device at home or in the hospital. These sort of details are the indications for use. The intended use is the goal. Regulation will be based on a mix of pre-market requirements, what you need to show and prove and do before you can commercialize the product, and post-market, all the monitoring you need to do about your product to, more particularly, prove that you have the capability to bring it back, to recall it in case there's a problem. And the regulation of technology is very much based on the concept of classification. Thresholds, level of risk. The more risky your device is based on certain definition, the more requirements you have to conform with to be able to commercialize the technology. It's based on the implementation of a quality management system. You need to have formal processes in place within your organization to describe how you gather user requirements, how you test your product, how you validate the efficacy of your product, how you control your materials. All those things need to be done into a quality management system. And it will be based on two principles of safety and effectiveness to which you may conform with, or for class 2 in the US, which is a weird thing, it's called the 510K, you may have heard of the 510K. You need to prove that your device is equivalent to a device already on the market. You don't prove that your device is safe and effective, you just prove that it's equivalent. With the concept of equivalence being a bit weird, you prove no physical characteristic and intended use are the same. It's based on the concept of risk management. You need to manage the risk created by your product or appearing because of the use of your product. And you can use the concept of risk benefit to justify the countermeasures you implement into your product to mitigate that risk. The concept of design controls, that you can't just design something and put it out. You need to control all the steps of your design, from gathering your user requirements, putting your rough design together, refining your design, testing them, validating them, etc., etc. And the use of technical standards are recognized by most countries' regulation to be a tool for you to prove that you are conforming to the safety and effectiveness principles. So one quick concept, the one of harmonization, which is the keyword that the international medical device regulator forums have been using for 30 years to say that they are working hard to facilitate the work of manufacturers by harmonizing regulations and standards between different countries. And with their latest achievement, to have the ability to have the same entity auditing manufacturers for all the participating countries, so 7 or 8 countries. That's their latest achievement in 2017. Until then, it meant that pretty much you had to be audited by regulators for every single country you would commercialize your technology into, which is a huge expense, as you can imagine. When you're talking about innovation and startup and all that, that's a big demand for them. So back to Australia itself, TGA is the main regulator of medical technology or all therapeutic goods. They have adopted what they call a carve-out policy. They are carving out a lot of software-based technology from the regulation, either by excluding them completely, they don't want to deal with them, or exempting them from most of the requirements, still expecting the manufacturers to be accurate in the manufacturing, in the advertising, and to notify them if they are made aware of issues and adverse events, but otherwise not asking them to do all the things I was talking about in the previous slides. The TGA is backing up. And one example of excluded product are an app that does CBT, widely accepted clinical practice, in a way that is reviewable by the user. So as soon as you put a reference to a clinical guideline, the app, you can commercialize it in Australia, so TGA is not interested into that. I show another picture as an example of things that is regulated, magnetic transcranial simulation that's used for the treatment of depression. This, of course, the TGA is much involved into this sort of technology, and you can't even update your product without talking to the TGA to make sure whatever you do is certified by them. The FDA in the US is a bit more active and involved into approving technology for mental health. They have recently authorized, for example, a VR-based program or application to treat pain and anxiety, I think, if I recalled, as well as various apps for the treatment of insomnia, addiction, including opioid addiction, alcohol, etc. So there's a slight difference of spirit and implications from the FDA and the TGA. So So those are the technology regulators, but there's a lot of other voices that are very active into regulating technology. So the MSIA, that's the Medical Software Industry Association, that's a professional lobby that wrote to the TGA to ask them to carve out all medical software. That's the reason why now the TGA has decided to do that without really a public debate. I mean, it was a public consultation from the TGA. Say, okay, here is this proposal. The MSIA sent a letter to the TGA, which is accessible online. The TGA just did whatever the MSIA was asking, more or less. The Digital Health Agency from the government is, of course, providing a lot of advice and guidelines about what the regulations are or should be. The World Health Organization has made mental health a priority and is providing some guidelines and recommendations as well. The World Economic Forum is very active in that space as well, and has sponsored a white paper to be written by Deloitte, which is an 80-page document, very thorough document, a toolkit recommending what the regulation of mental health technology should be. And this program is currently a pilot program by the New Zealand government following the recommendation from Deloitte. Other voices, so just an example of the privacy that there are apparently several hundreds of private bodies in the world that are offering privacy regulations. The standards organizations, the ISO, are providing both technical standards and guidelines that have to be, can be followed or have to be followed. The IEEE is also putting out standards for technology. And of course, the big tech, Silicon Valley technologies, they are putting together groups and lobbies to produce policies and guidelines and rules to produce safe and effective technology in the space of AI. We have a lot of more scientific approach to it. You know, the field of technology ethics is very prolific. There's a lot of new journals appearing in this field. It's almost hard to keep up with that. I just put a few examples of that. Very different still from the white paper of Deloitte, which are providing recommendations, but that's not peer reviewed, that's not referenced. Those are scientifically based recommendations. And the other voices, and I was very glad both yesterday to see Jenny's testimony and this afternoon to learn about this concept of consumer academic, which I've never heard about, the voice of the patient. That's something that I mentioned already, the diabetes. That's something that I've seen the FDA, for instance, very active about it, about engaging the patient into drafting regulations based on the real need of the patient. The TGA is not at this level yet, I believe. I hope things will change a little bit. The Hippo AI, for instance, is quite interesting. That's a European non-profit foundation who advocates for open innovation and open data to make sure patient data cannot be commercialized, cannot be profited from, at least without the patient being the driver of this process. Heidi, who is actually a friend, is someone with implanted hardware in her heart and who is very active with the FDA and with all the bodies in the States to make sure the voice of the parents, of the patient, is present in all discussions about regulations and policy for technology. So when I say it's a complicated formula, that's what I meant. And when Hamilton put his side with all the regulation about mental health that I didn't know about, I would have to add even more to that. There's other scientific publication calling it the hot potato of regulation of mental health. I just did a text search into this paper with the word ethics. And funnily, there's not much mention of it. So I think there's a sort of a missing link to me, because the purpose of the regulation should be really to assist into technology to be ethical. But the two concepts are not that close, at least into the literature. On the top, that just to show that there was this big this big peak of interest into ethics and guidelines and principles for safe AI, for fair AI, all those things in 2018. This peak seems to be tapering a little bit now. And the blue slides actually is original research I took. So that's the AI ethics lab in the US that did the graph with MacGyver of finding 180 principles declarations that have been issued by big consulting agency, governments, universities. I took the abstract from these 180 declarations and I looked at the frequency of keywords. And human and transparency as the first two keywords in front of privacy. More intuitively, I was more or less expecting privacy to be the top one, but thankfully it was transparency. And we'll see why I'm thankful for that a bit later. So this state of facts, I'm going to use a tool that is sort of a consulting tool, the SWOT, the strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats, which I find very useful into when you're complexing to sort of help you sort out your key terms and put them into categories a little bit more efficiently. So weakness, the regulators is slow. This big international forum of regulators, they have closing Monday, a consultation that has been open for several months to define the key terms and definition of AI. Right, we are in 2021. I don't need regulators to define the terms of AI for me. I go to Wikipedia. The Wikipedia page, it's updated every day. There will be some new advance based on the advance of technology because this field is going fast. So I think that's a weakness because we don't want to rely on regulators to define terms. We need the terms to be up to date, the definition to be accessible to everyone, to be debated publicly. So if I want to define something, I go to Wikipedia. No one is buying paper encyclopedias anymore for a good reason. Wikipedia is something that it's solid, it's reliable, and it's even traceable to who is advocating for this or that definition because you have the history of all the modification. And they have their own policy to avoid the Wikipedia wars and the edit wars. That is pretty effective. It's not perfect, but it's still better than a big boys club of regulators that discuss for months and months to define terms, to publish a white paper 6 months later when the terms has become completely obsolete. Another weakness is this concept of risk versus benefit. You are designing a product, you're supposed to make definition to balance risk versus benefit, but what you need to use for that? It's not a monodimensional thing, that's something that's bidimensional. The technical standards already know that a risk can be measured on 2 dimensions. You have the likelihood of something to happen and you have the severity of the things that happen. So you have already this concept of 2 dimensions here. But there's another dimension, the dimension of actually the implementation. When you are designing, you don't have any benefits. You have promises of your technology doing something good, and you have risk. And what you want to avoid is not the risks. The risks, they are there. That's a fact. Since humans have been making fires, there's risk. What you want is to mitigate the risk becoming harms. And on the other side, you want to make sure your promises become benefits. So what you are comparing is not the risk versus the benefits. What you are comparing is your probability of your promises becoming benefits and the probability of your risk becoming harms. And you are trying not to compare them, but to optimize this ratio in a given direction. So that's another weakness of all regulations. I think they're a bit too monodimensional and they don't take into account the complexity of this thing. This discrete classification, it's a weakness again, and to me it's shocking how it's a legacy from, of course, bureaucrats. When they created regulation, they were using paper system, so they had to define a certain number of drawers in which they could put the paper, more or less. Nowadays, there's no reason anymore to be limited by 2 or 3 categories. That's responsible for literally a chaotic behavior. A chaotic behavior is something when you have a tiny change of input, you get a huge change in your output. When you are an entrepreneur and you want to decide of your regulatory strategy, 1 word in your intended use can make you shift from category 1 or 0 up to category 3, talking from an investment of $50,000 in your regulatory strategy to an investment of several dozens of billions of $1 million. Because that's what it costs to validate certain level of technology. And it's completely counterintuitive. A condom has the same classifications on a critical care ventilator. I mean, how can it be efficient to base the same regulatory requirements for such different type of products on the same classification? And of course, there are huge barriers to entries, because that's this step from a few dozens of thousands to a few dozens of millions. Of course, this is causing a lot of startups not to be able to achieve the clinical benefits that they could potentially get, because they are limited to the cheap categories. And that's pushing entrepreneurship towards corporate, towards the Silicon Valley, towards venture capital, big money to be able to achieve these higher indications for use. This example, so that's a company from Brisbane, Canaria Technologies. They have this very neat, smooth monitors that measure heart rate and oxygenation, the pulse oximetry. They decided that the cost of going through the regulatory hurdles of the medical applications was too much for them. And they focused instead of OHSA application, just monitoring the staff wellness in mining. So we have this very promising technology. Instead of benefiting all Australians, it's benefiting only the mining industry, which ethically it's a bit weird, because we are trying to get rid of mining as a main industry and shifting to healthcare and high tech and all that. So again, that's classification is the reason for that. The weakness and the threat. So one of the keywords we have heard pretty much every talk today is trust. That's one of the roles, that's supposedly one of the roles of regulators. When we purchase a technology that has been approved by the TGA or the FDA, that's because we should be able to trust this technology. But as you can see in these few snippets, the two top ones are the FDA. Yes, whistleblower from the malpractice in clinical research organization, really cutting corners on all the things they should be. The FDA has been warned of that for months and months and months, and it's not doing anything. And it has been proven that they approve technologies that's not useful. So if there are millions of people in the street sometime protesting against vaccine, we have to give them some credit for not trusting the institution, for not doing their job properly because of their own behavior. We were talking about Deloitte putting together a guideline for ethical implementation of technology. Their own track record is not necessarily perfect. So becoming an actor of trust, an agent of trust in this system when you don't have a perfect record, that's a weird state of affairs, I find. And a threat, because 300,000 mobile health apps at the latest count. Advanced material, genomics, nanomaterial, AI, all the variant flavors of AI. To expect government agency and regulatory agency to cope with the sheer volume of application and the level of innovation and the space of innovation, that's too much. We can't expect the system as it is to cope with this size and this progress. So I think that's something we have to plan for. So I'm trying to turn this weakness into an opportunity by promoting transparency. And I'm not the only one to do that. The FDA are aware of their own lack of transparency, and we're animating last month a roundtable with a fascinating list of participants to discuss how they could promote transparency into machine learning application in healthcare. The Forbes are clarifying that the FDA lack of transparency is one of the causes of lack of trust from the public. And this meme was turning around sometime last year, but they see themselves sometimes as superheroes who are saving the public from bad technology and the like. But again, they are not necessarily doing a great work. I think this state of affairs is an opportunity to expose some bias, sorry, I never pronounced this word properly, in the regulation framework. Now, we're always talking about bias in algorithms, but it exists also in the regulators. And I think yesterday, Johnny was talking a lot about paternalism or patriarchism, calling it paternalism. That's this attitude of the regulators that I think is not positive and needs to be addressed. And transparency is also an opportunity to maybe revisit the efficacy of the regulation of the act. And I'm thinking about two recent examples of Britney Spears and Paris Hilton, who exposed two forms of abuse they have been the victim of for several years, in which mental health professionals have been involved into that all along. And there's a public movement of wanting transparency and wanting accountability into that. And I'm trying to keep an eye on what's happening at this level, because I'm, again, really interested into that, even though I don't have any background in there. But I think we need to embrace this opportunity to be more transparent and to implement more transparent policies and guidelines and regulations. An opportunity, again, to implement something instead of discrete classification, something that's continuous. And when you look, for instance, into research versus clinical practice, it's a shame to consider that two different things. It's a spectrum of things. And people should have the more freedom, thanks to transparency, to be able to choose more or less risky technology if they choose to do so. It shouldn't be a paternalistic regulator who tells them, okay, this technology is above the threshold, you can use it. This one is underneath, you can't. And again, the vaccination has shown us that people don't like to be lied to, don't like to be hidden the facts. And having an honest debate about the side effects of vaccine, for instance, is very hard. And there's a movement from the regulator to try to shut down all protests related to discussing the side effect, which is not really positive. In research, there's this push also towards always RCTs, and RCTs, so randomized clinical trials, are controlled trials, randomized controlled trials, are the only good objective evidence. Case studies are nothing. But case studies, like we have seen today, they have a very powerful message. And if you consider the definition of intelligence as the ability to achieve goals, conscience as the ability to have subjective experience, if we want to achieve a level of societal consciousness, of collective consciousness, you need to value those case studies. And I'm referring to Rabelais, the French philosopher from the 16th or 17th century, that science without conscience is ruination of the soul. And if we want to be soulful scientists, we need to really embrace this opportunity to use case studies and patient engagement and patients who are willing to take risk with technology to be part of this whole debate about the regulation of technology. There is an ongoing effort, again, the Journal of Clinical Investigation, to use real-world data for research. We don't need only RCTs. We have the ability, again, with computers, AI is a fantastic opportunity to make sense out of data that has not been generated by an RCT. There's a little threat, not sure if it's really a threat, that's something that I'm a bit uncomfortable with. These two companies, Opin and HealthMatch is in Sydney, who are offering commercial services to match patients and trials. I can't explain why this is making me uncomfortable, but I think this idea of monetizing the relationships between a patient and a technology in the scope of a trial, I'd like to study that a bit more. So to come back to this list of what is currently the regulation asking the manufacturers to do, I'm focusing for once on the strengths. Because in this list, I don't like classification. I try to explain why. Quality management systems are great. Being audited by the TGA is a pain in the butt, a major one, and it has affected my mental health actually to have to go through that every year and a half. But the principles of quality management systems are great, and that can be done well. Safety and effectiveness, of course, we want safety and effectiveness, but conformity, I think the keyword is important, that conformity versus innovation, there's a bit of cognitive dissonance again there. So I think safety and effectiveness should be principles that are used as values into design. Equivalence, of course, you should get rid of that. And safety and effectiveness should be used as values. as well as privacy, fairness, and justice, all those things that we had in the blue chart earlier, and that has been mentioned by several other intervenants today. Risk management, of course, again, is a great element of manufacturing and designing technology, but the concept of risk benefit, it's not the role of the manufacturer or the regulator to decide what's the right risk benefit balance. It should be the patient or potentially the practitioner, the medical practitioner, but not the regulator or the manufacturer. This should be completely out of the equation, with transparency instead, ensuring they have access to the level of information they need to make an informed consent decision. Design control, I'm all for, if it's done again with transparency. And technical standards, yes, that's good to have standards. Everyone is asking for standards, but the reason for the but is that technical standards, they have become a very juicy business. Should they? That's a juicy business based on the concept of copyright. If you I know there are lawyers in this room, copyright is meant to protect creative work. A technical standard is supposed to be a snapshot of industry standard, industry practice. Where the creation is there? There should not, standards organizations should not benefit from the copyright to be able to make money out of technical standards. And again, through my non-profits, I have seen countless projects of open source people in India, in Africa, trying to access standard to know how to do safe technology. But when you have to pay $300 for a standard that you live in a low and middle income country, that's a big expense. You would prefer to put these $300 into materials or testing or something. That's something I'm advocating for a lot. So the bottom one is the latest standard that was released in September, IEC 82304 for health application. So that's a standard, it costs 183 francs if you want to buy it from the IEC or the ISO, I can't remember. All it does, it gives you a template, how to put the same label you have on the washing machine, how to put it on your app, and how you're supposed to rate your app with this little scale of, no, sorry, it's not very clear to read, healthy and safe, easy to use, secure data, robust build. So that's the level of technical standards we are dealing with when we talk about health app and mental health app. And yes, so this was an article from someone from the IEEE, so one of those bodies that generate technical standards for the development of technology. And in the interview, the person was asked to describe the main principle behind this standard with a focus on physical harm. So I was thinking, why physical? And harm measured by adherence to regulation. So does regulation really help you protect the patient from harm? But earlier we learned that regulation are relying on standards to protect you from harm. And then you look at the people who write standards and they say that the regulation is protecting you from harm. Okay, so where the protection is actually coming from if you guys are throwing the ball at each other? And this concept of, again, of physical was actually raised by the interviewee himself, that use physical because mental health cannot be measured in metrics like gross domestic product. To my knowledge, physical harm cannot be measured in gross domestic product either. I mean, this whole thing, to me, there's a lot, way too much focus on the technical standards as opposed to the ethical involvement of the person who are designing the technology, who should be ethical, etc. So I'm trying to be a bit positive in terms of opportunities. Again, I'm a big fan of open source. I'm not the only one. Elon Musk gave away all the patents from Tesla in 2014. They are all open source. That doesn't prevent him from making a crapload of money and having the biggest electric car company in the world. There's a lot of actually of open source health software available. So if you guys are interested to look into that, probably you are using them already. That was last weekend in Sydney at the Earth Neighborhood. That's the mock-up of the helicopter Ingenuity that flew on Mars on March or some April this year. It's using Linux. If NASA is using Linux, that's not for a matter of cost, but because that's the best tool for the job, because it's reliable, etc., etc. There's a cultural thing in healthcare that Linux and open source is not well known, and that's something I'm trying to advocate for as well. And again, open standard to replace those technical standards behind paywall, behind copyright. Wikipedia would do a better job at putting down what is best practice for technical implementation. Predictive thing, we have discussed a lot of that. I won't mention more. Voice, we have mentioned that as well, so I won't spend much time. Network sort, so that's a screenshot of Roam Research, which is a tool that allows you literally to type, like in Wikipedia, your own notes. And I think there's this sort of technology to really cross-link your keywords in your own notes are a very promising tool for professionals in mental health. Because note-taking is the core of the job. And we discussed a lot about natural language processing. I think technologies like e-ink tablets, the remarkable tablet, I don't know if you guys have ever tried that. That's impressive. The quality of handwriting you can get on those tools, and then digitizing OCR in a push of a button instead of typing. And the example given by the journalist is the one of a therapist that the patient wouldn't want to hear click, 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 or to see an iPad, which is not really a professional tool. Those new tools have really a sleek appearance like a notepad, are completely silent, and give you a fantastic writing experience. I haven't gotten one yet because they're a tiny bit expensive, but soon. Threats, big risk. That's two screenshots from an episode of Designated Survivor where the therapy recordings of POTUS, president, have been hacked. Of course, it creates a huge political crisis. So it's a bit sci-fi, but yeah, that's a threat and a risk we need to be aware of. Of course, the notes of someone ending up as a tool for piracy, as a tool for hacking, etc. Same thing with technology. If your brain is connected to technology, definitely you don't want your brain data to end up in the web somewhere. Good old risk of frustration of using technology. I mean, we have all been a bit mad at our computer. I must say that I'm something I'm disappointed into the last 20 years. You know, for 20 years, we have heard about talking to a phone, talking to a computer, not having speak interface and all that. I mean, every day I'm typing my password 3 times because you have to go this crazy password, trying to talk to a phone doesn't understand you. I mean, all the text driving accident. I believe we should be able to do technology more, better, faster, not to text anymore and to talk to your phone when you're driving. We should be there already. Why is it's not working the way it could? If we use more open technology for this sort of thing, we would have access to better database, bigger database to train technology better. And of course, the concept of digital addiction. It was funny to see Reddit being mentioned twice today. I love Reddit myself, but that's one of the worst karma addictive kind of social media because you're really posting stuff just in hope of getting karma. And I won't expand more. Just a few crazy ideas. I'm going really left field here. So yeah, transparency. I'm not the only one to think we should do more. The Moravec landscape. So the blue picture is the concept that every single discipline that people have said, oh, humans are still better than AI, the sea is raising up, and it was chess, and then it was Go, and then it was this and that. Regulating will be there one day. And AI will be better than human at being able to proactively assess a technology to say, oh, this technology is safe enough to release or not. And when that happens, do you think AI is gonna look at your risk management table and making formula out of the number you put into your risk management? Or should AI listen to the tone of the voice of the technology executive? Because when you think about Challenger blowing up because management decided that the engineers were wrong, they were right. Theranos, when the entrepreneur was saying, oh, we don't show our data to the FDA, we're gonna be billionaires by hiding the data. We know that AI has a capability to detect when someone is lying. So if we want AI to be regulating technology, that's all you need. And if technology ends up being a bit risky because someone made a bad decision, but on goodwill, why not? I'm okay with this sort of risk. What I don't want is to be given technology that is being approved by the same kind of people who approved Challenger or who did Theranos. I talked about music yesterday. I think the arts has an incredible opportunity to do science a bit differently, maybe to accept the concept of intuition, to accept having to deal with black box and implicit versus explicit reasoning. I think this whole debate about designing AI is a great opportunity to look into our society, how it's designed, and maybe to build a collective consciousness. There's plenty of evidence about the link between leadership and psychopathy. That would be great, I believe, if this link was now a link between, for instance, Asperger and leadership. And Young Sheldon is an example I put. I find this type, I don't know if you have seen this show, but I really recommend it. So art, in that sense, is a much better tool than science at breaking the stigma of mental health. And this show did a fantastic job at that. Sheldon, so Asperger, his friend Asperger, who just had a breakdown, spent several months in a psychiatric hospital, and they are talking about it naturally, and the rest of the family is freaking out. And I think our society is a bit like that. No, our society is not mature enough to hear about this difficult debate. And I'd like our society to be more mature, to be more open to have this discussion. I'll be very quick. I know I'm extending my time. My first degree was in physics. The critical point in physics is a state of matter when you heat up and pressure things enough, the difference between liquid and gas disappears. I think in a world, you have also the world of ideas and the world of physics, the world of art stuff, the world of atoms and the world of bits, the world of physical health and mental health. I think the progress of AI is an opportunity to reach this critical point. And I think the singularity is this critical point where everything becomes a big philosophy and science become one. I know I may sound crazy, but I like science fiction. I think it's the time to have this discussion. And I'll skip the last few things. So in conclusion, I believe in a transparent regulation to be ethical, to help people make informed decisions, not the nanny state making decisions for them. Nanny state should be just here to enforce transparency, to prevent liars and misbehaving people to try to put technology on the market. So that's my hypothesis for the real research to start. So far, it was just me, spending time in evenings and weekends doing that. I think we have really the opportunity to design a regulatory approach instead of having to cope with a regulatory framework that has evolved historically. We have now the ability to do design based on values, again, transparency, privacy, dignity, all those values. And my co-author, Stephen Umbrello, has published a lot about value-based design. Thank you very much. If you want to send me contact details, I would be more than happy. And I'm playing in Melbourne the 13th of February, some music, so come over. Thank you very much. Yeah, sorry for the time.
Hi, thank you. It's not a question, it's just a comment. I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about like regulators needing to be less paternalistic.
Yes.
And I just thought it was an interesting paradox when you think about psychiatry and mental health probably being one of the most paternalistic areas of healthcare, particularly in terms of the ability to and it seems like a lot of the technology that's happening in the space is increasing the ability for those for paternalistic interference.
Okay.
In terms of the increase of like surveillance of symptoms and monitoring patients. That was an interesting
Yes. I don't know if you expect a response, but I agree it's a huge paradox. But I think if it's, the concept of knowing is not really paternalistic. When you talk about paternalistic, it's making decision instead of. So if technology offers you the ability to have more information, it will not mean you would do more decision, you would take away more decision-making power, but at least you would increase the quality of the decision-making you're doing. And transparency will increase at least the accountability. So again, think about Paris Hilton or Britney Spears. if the process is transparent, and by transparent, I don't mean the private data of the patient need to be exposed transparently. I mean the processes of the institution needs to be transparent. That would increase the accountability of the professional who's non-ideally having to be paternalist a little bit, but at least if he's accountable to society for his paternalistic approach, the global equation should be better.
Well, not a real question, but back to the healthcare active news page. I'm just curious, something kind of relevant. I'm not 100% sure about Australia, but in the US, FDA requires all the medical device has to report the adverse events. But I'm just thinking about the mental health apps. What are the adverse events and how to define the adverse events and how to report them? Do you have any idea about it?
The definition of adverse event, and technically you have to report near adverse event as well as a manufacturer. So the definition of an adverse event is easy, that's no injury. They don't give you guidelines how to assess psychological trauma as a form of injury, sadly, but that's something they need to progress as well into. And this slide, 300,000 mobiles, they are all available on US app stores. So the FDA is not regulating those. Even if they'd like to, they're not. They can't cope with the volume of it. So how are they going to report that? I don't know exactly, but social media, public exposure is, without regulator, it's working. Now, look at police violence in the US. It was never authorized before to beat up people without reason, but they were doing it nonetheless. Technology has opened a window to the public of the misaction of certain individuals. Whether it triggers a change of regulation, I don't care, but the change of regulation is not what was needed. What was needed was transparency to fix this problem, to make the public aware of it. So honestly, a rating on the App Store, by themselves, there's no reason they shouldn't raise the adverse event. You have the risk of karma farms and the manufacturers and implementing AI to raise positive reviews and this sort of thing, which again, if you use open source technology, it's much harder for hackers and misintentioned people to tweak the reviews. If your technology is open, everyone can review that you can't tweak the technology. And you have things like, it's too early for me to know how it would work together, but there's other people working on that blockchain can be used as an instance to protect the privacy of individual people to rate, so that to make sure they are a genuine people, not a bot somewhere positively rating the app, while protecting their privacy. And I think that's a huge direction of progress as well, to work towards technology as a means of protecting privacy while fostering transparency and people being able to share their data for big data learning without exposing too much of their personal information.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.